Hi, everybody. I'm Bendy White, one of the council members, and with me is Randy Rouse and Helene Schneider, our mayor. And tonight we're taking on the topic yet again of Santa Barbara's infrastructure. And we've been working on this ourselves for a couple of years, trying to put together, quantify what the city's situation is around some key resources. And then tonight we were going to hear a little bit of an update. We went out to the public over the last 6 months or so and have gotten feedback on what are the high priority areas that people are concerned about with our wonderful city. It's a wonderful city that we've inherited and we're trying to take care of, and yet we're finding that certain critical pieces are not being maintained properly. So you're going to hear a little bit of that update. Maybe some of you, I've talked to a couple that have looked on the website already, but Nina Johnson, our staff member, will give us a closer update, and then we'll be talking a little bit more about where we go from here. So now I'll turn it over to Randy, and thank you for coming.
Hi. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that this is not staff-driven. It's certainly not council-driven. This is driven by our putting together a presentation to illustrate what we have out there, and then to get instructions from you on what your priorities are and what you'd like to do about them eventually. We're going to be presenting you with a menu of options to tell you what is in the world of possibilities out there in terms of solving the problems we have. This problem is not unique to Santa Barbara. The entire country is having this very discussion right now. And in many cases, small agencies like Santa Barbara, other cities, are taking this on because we're a little bit more nimble and more quick than the larger state or federal agencies might be. But it is indeed a national problem. We want to see how you want to address it, and we want to get the instructions from you to go forward. And here is our mayor to wrap that up.
I just want to thank you for taking the time to be here, and I know many of you were part of the dialogues that we had in the last several months. It's talking about infrastructure is not exactly the most exciting thing to talk about, but it's an essential part of what makes the city work and what makes it as great of a place as it can be. So hearing from you has just been very helpful to us, and we hope tonight can give you some good information about what we heard from all the various meetings. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nina Johnson, and really want to thank staff as well for all the work that they put in making all this happen up to date. So Nina.
Thank you. Good evening. So I'm Nina Johnson. I'm the assistant to the city administrator, and I'm here today to present some of the findings of our outreach efforts that we conducted in the fall and winter. Just to give you a little bit of background, because some of you might have joined us for those meetings and some of you might be new to the discussion. In 2008, an infrastructure task force, a private group of community members, convened and reviewed the city's infrastructure needs. They concluded that we had a significant shortfall in funding our infrastructure needs for basic maintenance and upgrade of our facilities. Last year, and here are the members of the task force, last year, council appointed a special council committee to do public outreach with the community and help everyone understand the true condition of our facilities, our streets, the condition of our sidewalks, and learn about the community's experience. Hear everyone's priorities and suggestions for how to make these improvements and where we should be focusing our attention. So let me take a moment and recap our challenge. It's important for everyone to recognize that we have a lot of older historic buildings still in use, and the challenge facing all of us is how can we make smart investments to make sure we keep these facilities viable for continued use and ensure that they're safe, clean, and modern enough to meet the community's demands. With tight budgets for several years, we've been triaging our funding towards the highest priorities, and that means that we've had to make some difficult decisions, even closing facilities in some cases if they're not safe and they're needing urgent repairs. During the recession, the state eliminated redevelopment agencies, and this was a very significant moment because that meant the loss of $16 million a year in funding that we used at that time to revitalize the downtown and waterfront areas. So that funding was used to renovate the Carrillo Recreation Center, the fire station, their headquarters on Carrillo, a number of buildings, State Street sidewalks, many projects throughout the downtown and waterfront areas. So that's a pretty big loss of funding for us. The community may see construction work around town as you drive around, but the truth is a lot of that is funded through outside grant funds. We've been very successful in leveraging outside grant funds to get a lot of work done, but we can't count on those grant funds in the future. And there aren't grant funds to help us pay for some of the vital projects like the police station and fire station. On the screen, you'll see a few images. Grant funds have been very helpful in replacing 100-year-old bridges and upgrading dangerous intersections, but we can't find those funds for some of the more essential buildings. In the past decade, we've steadily made progress to upgrade our community buildings so that they're seismically safe, our parking structures, the airport terminal, the fire station. But our 1960 police station still isn't prepared for an earthquake. And this is where we're starting to lose a lot of money to quick fixes. We recently moved all of the dispatchers out of the police station basement and into the top floor of the Granada garage. The total cost, the price tag to move everyone out and build a functioning 911 call center is $2.3 million. Moving out to our streets, we're also seeing a lot of quick fixes to keep our roads in decent condition. Funding levels haven't changed much in the last few decades. Gas tax revenue, which is basically pennies on the gallon, it's buying us less and less. Cost of asphalt has risen very sharply in the last decade. So we've tried to make the best use of the $2 to $3 million a year that we have year over year by slurry sealing one of 6 sections of the 6 neighborhoods every year. But really, we're not able to do the work that needs to be done to fix the roads and to do the real repaving, the more expensive work. So that remains to be done. If we continue using this approach of just slurry sealing and painting over the cracks, really, at some point, very soon, poor road quality is going to be more noticeable to the community. Maybe we don't see it now on some of the arterials, but at some point, we can't really continue on this point without having more noticeable problems with our roads deteriorating. So the bottom line is we're losing money to a lot of quick fixes that aren't really solving the problem and are costing us more money. The Infrastructure Council Committee spent a lot of time reviewing our projects and our upcoming needs, and they looked out for 20 years. Our ballpark estimate is that funding a lot of the maintenance and upgrades of our current buildings, our current facilities and streets, is estimated to cost around $400 million. And I want to mention that, this is an estimate that includes some projects that maybe the community doesn't have an interest in, so that number could come down a little bit. But if we were to break that out over 20 years, that's approximately $20 million per year. So to fine-tune our estimates and get better information from the public, learn what your priorities are, we convened a series of community conversations, and we held 17 meetings altogether, 8 with the general public and many with neighborhood associations, service organizations, community groups. We worked with a lot of groups to help reach out to their members, so if you were able to attend some of those meetings, we appreciate your help. A large part of our engagement effort was use of an informal survey tool. We basically, at our meetings, we got responses and feedback on the survey and also online. It was available in English and Spanish. Altogether, we received almost 500 survey responses. So that gave us some really good preliminary feedback, and that's what we're going to review today. And I want to mention that this was not intended to be a scientifically valid survey. It was intended to give us a good first look at what the community's interests and priorities were. So now, if we take a look at our public outreach effort and what we heard, we asked everyone a very tough question. If you controlled the city's budget, how would you rank our facilities in spending on upgrades and modernization, replacement? And overall, overwhelmingly, streets and pavement maintenance came out at the top of the list, followed by the police station, and then sidewalks. A third of the people who responded to the survey marked as their #1 response, streets and pavement maintenance. If you add in what everybody marked as #2 on their rankings, you can see again, street and pavement maintenance come up very high. Sidewalks bumps up a little bit further to #2. and then the police station and our fire stations. And I want to mention that a lot of people struggled with how to rank these because they knew that many of these facilities create the fabric of our community, and they're all very important, but still people were challenged and they put down their rankings. We also received a lot of comments about keeping all of these facilities safe and clean, that was an overwhelming theme throughout many of the comments, that we need to make sure our recreation facilities, libraries, all of them are clean and in good condition. In terms of the suggestions, we had a lot of great discussions at our meetings. People brought a lot of creative ideas and shared different approaches for how we could take a look at things. From here, I'm going to share some of the common themes that we heard often because there's so many different ideas and we want to hit the highlights. First, we heard a strong interest in expanding our public-private partnerships, working closer with nonprofits, foundations, business entities to keep projects moving forward. We heard a desire to be more aggressive in working with on philanthropy. How can we encourage more people to contribute to some of our city projects? This is an area we're doing a lot of work on already. An example, we're right here in the library, and many of you may know that due to our work with the Junior League and the Santa Barbara Library Foundation, we are now under construction with the Children's Library because they were able to help raise the funds needed for that project. So that's a great example of a public-private partnership already in place. And we have several in different departments, Parks and Recreation especially. Also, people talked about naming opportunities, helping people donate to projects and loosening up any of our restrictions related to naming facilities. Many people expressed an interest in seeing more volunteer opportunities and community projects to help people lend a hand and get more involved in some of our projects. One creative idea for a public-private partnership was the use of a crowdfunding site, something like Kickstarter, the website that allows people to contribute for a small enhancement, a $10,000 project, $15,000, where everyone can donate $10 or $100 to meet the full funding goal. So these are some of the ideas that came about during our discussions. Since street maintenance was a high priority in a lot of our comments, it's not a surprise that a lot of suggestions related to reviewing our street repair strategy and our planning to make sure we look at different ways of maintaining our streets. We received a lot of suggestions about reducing employee benefits and employee pensions, and we've made a lot of headway in this area. The size of the organization since 2009, we've reduced it by 6%. So since 2009, we've reduced the size of the city organization by 69 positions. So today, the city organization is the same size as it was in 1999. And then as it relates to pensions, council has been working very closely with the employee labor groups and all of the city employees. They all contribute the full portion of their pension benefit. So that offsets what the city once paid. So if you look at the last year alone, employees are now contributing the $6 million that the city once paid for their pension benefits. We also received suggestions to sharpen our pencil and restructure our costs wherever we could to increase the amount of funding available for our infrastructure needs. And one example there is that council adopted a policy that 50% of any budget surplus be directed to our unfunded infrastructure needs. We also heard from people about various funding suggestions, revenue enhancements, considering increasing the sales tax, our transient occupancy tax, or TOT, that affects hotel beds and vacation rentals, property tax increase, issuing bonds, parking fees, maybe eliminating the free parking period or raising the rates. We heard some ideas related to any proposed funding revenue increase that we directed to specific projects instead of a full list of projects, all of our infrastructure needs. And then really quickly, I'll highlight a few others. We heard from people that they're interested in seeing us analyze the cost benefit of moving forward on certain facilities. Maybe there are opportunities to generate more revenue by renovating a building. We could recover more of our costs. Or encouraging recreation facility users or library users to pay higher fees for the buildings that they're using. And many people acknowledge that some of our buildings might not be used very often, and it may be okay to reduce or eliminate funding for some of our seldom used facilities. A lot of our downtown merchants, because they're affected by some of the recent power outages, encouraged us to work very closely with Southern California Edison to upgrade electrical infrastructure so we could prevent some of the power outages. The electrical infrastructure is not part of the city's responsibility. We don't maintain it, but council has been working very closely with Edison to encourage them to make that a top priority so we can get that fixed and keep the lights on. And then also we heard suggestions to work with our utilities to improve our broadband connectivity in any way so we can improve internet service. Overall, the Infrastructure Council Committee reviewed all of the input that we got through the surveys, all of the comments at our meetings, and in the end, they came up with the following findings: that we wanted to expand public-private partnerships. We've done a lot of work there already, but expand our public-private partnerships so that we can move forward on various library projects, park and recreation facilities, and our community centers. Review our municipal code and insurance requirements, our naming ordinance, to allow more flexibility for philanthropy, helping people make donations for projects. And then finally, the committee concluded that really more information was needed now that we started the discussion of what our infrastructure needs were, looking more closely at our infrastructure funding options. So council directed us to look into a formal poll, conducting a formal polling effort so we can do a scientific survey method and get more information on what people would be interested in moving forward on. And then convening a community meeting, which is where we are here today, just to see what everyone's interests are in funding. So if we start moving into some of what it would take, the funding options, and looking at our highest priority capital projects, the projects that came in the highest on our survey results, the police station replacement. To replace the police station to make it seismically safe, our last estimated cost based on preliminary design work was $60 million. So it may have come up a little bit. We might want to think about $70 million today. We could issue a bond to cover the replacement costs of that type of project, could lend itself well there. In terms of sidewalks, repairing the sidewalks and doing infill, we currently budget $350,000 a year, and a lot of that money is used to match funds for grants. So the only option we have there is really to increase the amount of funding we have for sidewalk replacement. And we also have the State Street sidewalks. If we maintain them as we are now, at some point they're going to need to be replaced, but we could get 15, 20, maybe more years, depending on how everything goes. But we're looking at a ballpark range of $12 million to replace our sidewalks, but at some point they will need it. And then moving to street repair options. We currently spend $3 million to crack and slurry seal our arterials. So if we were to keep those in good condition, if we look at some additional options, if we were to add funding for our streets maintenance budget, what would that look like? So we have listed 3 options on the screen that we would focus additional money on actually reconstructing our roads, grind and overlay work that is more expensive. So if we were to spend an additional $5 million for grind and overlay work, and we could resurface some of our collector streets and residential streets, resulting in slight improvements. And I want to back up a moment and just mention when I talked about arterials that we're currently covering within the $3 million. Arterials mean our primary roads moving through town: State Street, Las Positas, Milpas, Cabrillo Boulevard, Cliff Drive. Those are our arterials. So when I reference collector streets, we're talking about Mitchell Terrena, Coda, La Cumbra, those roads, Alamar. And then the residential streets are in the residential neighborhoods. Then an additional $8 million on top of the $3 million, we would be looking at resurfacing the full system of collectors in residential streets and see significant improvements on all of those streets. And these are all asphalt streets. If we were to bump up to an additional $10 million for grind and overlay work for a total budget of $13 million, we would see system-wide improvements. Not only would we be able to focus on the residential streets and the collectors, we would be able to do work that we currently currently don't fund at all on reconstructing concrete streets and also alleys. Currently, alleys and concrete streets don't get any attention because there's not enough money to fund that work. It's very expensive work. So at the $10 million level, we would see system-wide improvements in our roads. And this is all over a period of 20 years, so it wouldn't happen in a year, but over the course of 20 years. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to Finance Director and Assistant City Administrator Bob Samario.
Good evening, everyone. Bob Samario. So I am going to be talking about some revenue options, but I first want to mention that early on, Nina talked about a $400 million number that we may need to fund over the next 20 years. It's a rough estimate, but it sort of gives us a sense of what the order of magnitude is. And it does break down, as she said, about $20 million per year. What we're going to look at are some options for how we might raise money, ongoing revenue sources that cover about half of that, about $10 million. So we wanted $10 million per year. How could we get there? And we're going to look at some of those options. And starting with the first one, which is our sales taxes. One thing we can do is raise sales taxes. And just some information about it now is that our current rate in the Santa Barbara County is 8%. Cities get, in the city of Santa Barbara, gets 1% of that 8%. Most of that actually goes to the state. So cities and counties get 1%. We also have a half-cent sales tax that's a regional, countywide sales tax that goes to regional improvements for transportation. But what we're talking about is the 1% right now. And we get from that 1% about $22 million. That's where our projection is for this year. So 1% generates $22 million. It's our second largest revenue in our general fund. So if we were to raise that sales tax by 0.5%, that would generate about half of that, $10.7 million, not quite half. Keep in mind that the sales tax number, that would be the first year, but we would expect that to grow over a period of time, and maybe in 10 years it might be closer to $15 million per year. So if we were to raise it by 0.5%, then our sales tax rate in the county would be 8.5%, at least for city residents. So this is a comparison to other cities, our neighboring cities on the Central Coast. On the right, you can see the orange bar is City of Santa Barbara at 8%. And what you can point out and see is that everybody in Santa Barbara County is about 8%. In Santa Maria, they recently approved a 0.25 cent sales tax increase to fund fire stations. That's why they're slightly higher. And you'll look to the left that Camarillo and Ventura in the Ventura County are at 7.5% because they don't have that countywide sales tax like we do in Santa Barbara County. Oxnard, also in Ventura County, they recently increased their sales taxes by 0.5%. That's why they're at 8%. So looking at our transient occupancy tax, it's another option. And first to show you what the range is in terms of other cities throughout the state. You can see it goes from a low of 10%, Carlsbad to the left, to a high of 15% in Anaheim. Anaheim clearly is a tourist destination, and their TOT is extremely high. We are at 12%, and as shown in this slide here, 10% of that total goes into our general fund. 2% was approved in 2001. It was part of Measure B by the voters, and that's restricted money that goes for creek restoration and water quality improvement projects. So the $10 million we get in the general, the 10% we get in the general fund equates to about $18.5 million. That's what we're expecting this year. So if we wanted to generate about $10 million, what would it take? It would take about another 5% on our TOT to get to that additional $10 million. That would put our rate at about 17%, clearly higher than anybody that in our neighboring communities. And this just shows you what the TOT rates are for our neighboring cities. We are to the far right. Carpinteria and Goleta also have a 12% rate. Others are at 10%, and Camarillo is the lowest at 9%. One of the other taxes that we could increase if we wanted to generate additional revenues is our utility users tax. It's currently applied to all utilities, virtually all utilities. You can see them listed there. It's currently at 6%. This year, we're expecting to generate $14 million from that 6%. Half of that goes into our streets programs. The other half stays in the general fund. So over the last 20 or so years since we've had it at 6%, we've allocated half of that, and it's by ordinance where we fund the streets programs. That's one of the primary funding sources for our streets programs. Again, half of it stays in the general fund. But if we were to raise that by over 7%, we would get to the $10 million. So it'd more than double the tax rate from 6% to 13%. One of the other options is to, rather than raise some kind of tax to generate ongoing revenue sources, is to do a one-time bond issue. And we would for example, we wanted to fund a police building at $70 million. We would sell bonds at $70 million, and it would be accompanied by what's called a property tax override. So property taxes would go up sufficient each year to cover the repayment of those bonds, but it would be really a one-time infusion of money to essentially do one or two projects, and then the money that you get on an ongoing basis is just to cover the debt service. There wouldn't be any extra money, for example, for other things like streets and sidewalks. So the voter requirements, if we wanted to raise taxes to whatever extent, it depends on how you use those monies, or at least that will determine what kind of voter approval you will need. So we want to do a general tax, so it's not specific to any kind of use. It would only require a simple majority of the voters to approve that. It is sometimes accompanied by what is called an advisory measure, which you'd ask the question on the ballot: if you were to approve this, how would you like that money spent? Would you like it to be spent for the following kinds of projects as examples? So it still requires only a 50% majority for plus one, but it sort of describes in some detail how that money might be used. A special tax, in contrast, is you specify how that money is going to be used. So it's dedicated for streets or sidewalks, but it'd be very specific. And because it's being specific, it does require a 2/3 voter approval, unlike a general tax. Seems kind of contradictory. You would think it'd be the other way around, but a special tax for a specific purpose would have to be approved at a 2/3 level. So there are a number of cities who have implemented what's called a district tax, or the increase to their sales tax. This is a table that shows how many cities, as of today, have some kind of a district tax where they've increased their sales tax by some amount. So about 14 cities currently have increased their sales taxes as a general tax, so they didn't describe for a specific purpose what it would be used for, at a quarter cent. So the first on the left is they did a quarter cent, quarter cent increase, and then some cities, or at least one city, did 0.375 increase. The vast majority raised their sales taxes by a half a cent, and then others 0.75, and then even some at a full 1%. If we were to do 1%, it would generate $20 million per year for us in our general fund. But you can see that a smaller number did implemented a half-cent sales tax as a special tax, so it's for a specific purpose. In fact, if you look at the total that are special tax, 25 of those, most of those were specific to either police or fire facilities. A smaller number were for streets, roads, or some kind of a transit project. They were specific to those projects. So a lot of cities in the state have already implemented some kind of a district tax.